Cool. All right. Well, we'll go ahead and get started. I'm JLo with Extinction Rebellion America, and I'm excited for Roger's speech today. I know it's going to be powerful and interesting and also instructive. We got a couple of housekeeping notes we're going to go through really quickly. I'll read through them in case some people can't see them. We're recording this video. All guests are muted so that we can have a really good high quality recording because we're going to post it up on the internet to share with folks. If you don't want to be seen on the video, you can go ahead and turn your video off, turn your camera off, no problem at all. The chat function is directed solely to the moderator, so it goes to me. Please, if you have a question, feel free to put your question for Roger in the chat directed at me, and you'll see that my name in there is XR-text questions here, so I hope that's a good enough instruction. If you have a question that we can't get to, we'll try and get to those later or post them someplace, but we're going to try and get to as many questions as possible. And we have someone who is actually very well versed in all things biblical, and he'll be putting those questions together for Roger, pretty much hopefully in order that we get them. But sometimes if we find something that's a little more exciting for Roger, that's slanted towards Extinction Rebellion in a deeper way, we'll probably focus on that one in order. To optimize your view for this presentation, you can in the upper right hand part of your screen on the Zoom there, go to speaker view. That should give you a little bit more, but we should have Roger highlighted in any case. Okay, as part of every single Extinction Rebellion America meeting that we have a purpose statement and a respect statement. I'm going to go ahead and read the purpose statement, and then maybe we can get Terry or John or Will to read the respect statement. So we are facing the breakdown of our planet's natural life support systems and runaway global heating. We love this world and the beings in it, and resolve to work together to save our families, our communities, our nations, and all people from suffering and destruction. We welcome everyone in XRA spaces and refuse to let our differences divide us. And we will force our governments to act by mobilizing vast numbers of ordinary Americans from all walks of life to join us in the streets for mass, nonviolent, civil disobedience. John, did you want to do our respect statement?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
We commit to a culture of respect as we work together, in person or online. We will communicate with mutual appreciation and kindness. We will speak from our own experience without making assumptions about what is in the minds and the hearts of others. When we disagree, we will assume goodwill on the part of others, even though we all sometimes lack skillfulness or understanding. When we point out harmful behaviors, we will refrain from canceling people by shaming, attacking, gossiping, or dismissing them with negative labels. We will only commit to tasks we can do, and will return those we have not been able to do. We are a community united in our work, and everyone is valued. We are family.
Thank you, John. That was great. So today we're going to be having a wonderful conversation. We're going to be hearing from Roger Hallam, and Roger's an organic farmer, and he'll tell you about that, and an Extinction Rebellion co-founder. But more germane to the topic today, Roger was brought up as a Christian in a Methodist church in the north of England. His mother was a Methodist preacher, and he attended church each Sunday and studied the Bible. It's on this basis, and basis of this experience, that he's called to communicate how we need to bear the cross at this time of existential threat to God's creation. So with that, Roger, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen and turn the call over to you, sir.
Yeah, well, thanks very much, JLo, and thank you so much, everyone, to come and hear me. I feel quite humbled and slightly outside my comfort zone giving this talk. I should say before I start that those of you that know me know I can be quite exuberant, and I think it came up at a meeting that we could do something, you know, to talk to Christians, and I went, yes, brilliant, let's talk to Christians. And then I got myself slotted into this thing to, you know, talk to Christians. I had this slightly egotistical fantasy of talking to the great and good of American Christendom, as it were. And I slightly, since then, I've slightly started questioning my motivation to the point where I'm feeling a lot less certain of myself. Let's put it like that. So I'm very pleased there's a whole bunch of people I know here. So I feel like I am partially amongst friends, and you know that where I'm coming from, I suppose. And where I'm coming from is, on the one hand, a sort of deeply humble recognition that the Christian tradition is massively powerful and complicated and profound, and I have no ambition. I have no ambition to to claim any objective interpretation. Let's put it like that. However, to juxtapose that, I have unabiding, passionate rage and urge to sort of communicate the horror of what we're about to enter into, and the absolute, my absolute clarity that the Christian tradition demands prophetic action. It oozes out of every sense of myself that this is a time of unparalleled challenge, right? An unparalleled challenge to what it is to be a Christian, and what it is to be a human being, to what it is to be whatever it is that we are, right? So I'm going to sort of do my usual thing, that I'm just going to give you my truth. And I've always felt, since I started doing talks, that's as much as I ever can do, and or as much as I ever would wish to do. And as J-Lo said, I have a background in the Christian faith. Maybe people better than me can describe what that status means, but I was very much imbued in a very strong Christian household. As J-Lo says, my mum was a Methodist preacher, and I went with the Methodist Church to India when I was 18, where people were getting shot and raped and dreadful things were happening. And it really changed my life in terms of a sense of what I needed to dedicate myself towards, which was to the common good. And that's my touchstone. And that touchstone is rooted in the witness and tradition of Jesus. So when Extinction Rebellion came around, for me, this was a reignition, really, of the prophetic tradition of witness in a generic sort of way. It wasn't, the Extinction Rebellion for me was not, let's create another secular, environmental movement. This necessarily required going so much deeper into the traditions that we're all part of. And of course, the Christian tradition is absolutely central to the way we see ourselves, whether we realize that or not. So I'm going to share with you a vision that's come through to me, and I'm hoping that with this audience, people understand what that means. And it will be what it will be, of course. So here goes. I want to start off with a practical orientation, and I want to talk about practicality quite a bit in this talk, because for me, one of the greatest attractions of the teachings of Christianity and Jesus is the intense practicality. So I'm going to start with the world as it is. And the world as it is in the most horrendous mess, an unbelievable mess. And we might want to argue over who's to blame for it and what to do about it. But I just want us all to acknowledge at this moment in history, this life that we've been thrown into involves us in the most catastrophic, unbelievably serious situation. And it is what it is. It is what it is. And this is what it is. I'm going to read short quotes from 3 of the most respected scientists in the world. These aren't scientists that necessarily see on, the TV or whatever. They're people that are intensely serious about their scholarship. The first one's Professor James Anderson of Harvard University, who, as some of you may know, was involved in discovering the ozone, the hole in the ozone in the late 90s. And he says that if, even when the Arctic ice melts, which is due to happen in the summer in 2030, within a decade or so, he says it's going to have profound damaging effects on life, not just on human beings, but also on our staple crops that provide food for the population. All of that will collapse. All of that will collapse. And there's a colleague at Harvard University, this guy's called Dr. Ye Teo, if I pronounced that right. So he's like an engineering scientist involved in geoengineering. And this is what he said a while ago. He said, we have to implement a solution on a global scale now within the next couple of years. Otherwise, it's game over for everybody. It's game over for everybody within a couple of decades. And then there's Sir David King. He is from my country, the UK. He was the chief scientific advisor to the British government, probably the most important scientific position in my country. And he said, just over a month ago, he said, we have to move rapidly. What happens in the next 3 to 4 years will determine the future of humanity. What happens in the next 3 to 4 years will determine the future of humanity. So for me, like, the Christian faith is intensely interested in what's happening here and now in human communities, in the communities that we're in. That's the basis of the faith. It's not a thinky thing. It's not a spiritual talky thing, right? It's a practical thing. It's about what's going on and acknowledging that what's going on is real because it is real. And what's happening is in the next 3, 4, 10 years, if there aren't massive changes, billions of people are going to experience undescribable levels of suffering and death. That's the reality. And I had the pleasure, if that's the right word, to talk to another of the leading world scientists who wrote a paper called The Future of the Human Niche, which you can translate as Where People Are Going to Live When It Gets Hot. And I was on a Zoom call with him because you can read this paper on the internet. It's only about 10 pages. And he said, their research said that when we get to 2 degrees centigrade, which is in the next 10 to 20 years, the estimate is there'll be 1,000 million people unable to live where they're living due to extreme heat and extreme weather. So there's going to be 1 billion people on the move. And I don't need to tell you, or I hope I don't need to tell you, that that will involve millions of deaths from war, millions of rapes, millions of people dying from starvation. For the first time in 10,000 years, the human race is facing the most catastrophic threat to its existence due to the unbelievable level of injustice imposed by those in power upon those without power. What I want to talk about is our relationship to God. And the reason I want to talk about our relationship to God is that I've reason to believe that our relationship to God is absolutely central to what it means to be within the Christian faith. And the catastrophe that I've just outlined is of such gravity that it goes way, way beyond some shallow engagement with environmentalism. I'm not going to be talking about how Christians may or may not relate to the environment in this talk. Partially because that whole framing supposes that the environment is something separate from ourselves, when it self-evidently is not, right? COVID is in our bodies, our children are part of our environment, our communities are the environment. We're all the same in God's creation. And secondly, that sort of orientation produces the notion that the environment is just there on the edge and we're basically fine. But as we increasingly are thrust into realizing it's here now in front of our eyes. You know, what's happened in Portland, what's happened in Vancouver, what's happening in China, in New Zealand, in Germany, it's here today and it's everything. It's not some old style issue or problem out there. It goes to the heart, morally and spiritually, of what it is to believe in the Christian faith. So it requires that level of seriousness. And the key question, I suppose, and I'm going to read more about this, is what it means to love God with all our heart. What does it mean to love God with all our heart at a time of apocalyptic threat? And I think we can get the answer to that question by looking at maybe what's I would consider anyway in the tradition I was brought up in, the Methodist tradition is probably the most famous story that Jesus shared with people, and that's the story of the Samaritan. So I hope you'll bear with me because it's not very long and I'm going to read it out. So this is taken from Luke. On one occasion, an expert in the law stood up to test Jesus. "Teacher," he asked, "what must I do to inherit eternal life?" "What is written in the law?" he replied. "How do you read it?" He answered, "To love God, to love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, and to love your neighbor as yourself." "You have answered correctly," Jesus replied. "Do this and you will live." But he wanted to justify himself, so he asked Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" In reply, Jesus said, "A man was going down to Jerusalem, to Jericho, when he was attacked by robbers. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. A priest happened to be going down the same road, And when he saw the man, he passed by on the other side. So too a Levite, when he came upon the place and saw him, he passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he traveled, he came where the man was. And when he saw him, he took pity on him. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he put the man on his donkey, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day, he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper. Look after him, he said, and when I return, I will reimburse you for any extra expense you may have. Which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of the robbers? The expert in the law replied, the one who had mercy on him. Jesus told him, go and do likewise. So I don't know about the people on this call, but when I was taught about that as a teenager, I think this one of the central messages is it's not who you are, it's what you do, right? It's like, my understanding is the Samaritans were hated, they were denigrated, and yet it was the Samaritan that stepped up. In other words, if you love God, you step up and look out for your neighbor. And it doesn't matter, as far as God is concerned, who you are. If you want to be close to God, it's not who you are, it's your actions that count. But the other thing that I'd like to just sort of draw out here is there's an intense practicality, as I've just mentioned, about this story. There's not an intention to help. There's not a willingness to engage in theory. There's not a culture of engagement. There's an actuality. The guy stops and he goes to this man who's half dead and helps him to live. So it's a real life event. And the other thing is, because it's a real life event, it requires real sacrifice. He has to stop. He has to pay the money. He has to take the risk that he's not going to be successful. He's got to take the risk that he could be attacked by the robbers. He could take the risk that he's going to run out of money. There's all sorts of risks because it's a real live thing. And the last thing is that there isn't a choice if you want to follow God. That's what Jesus is saying. This is not an option. You're passing the guy, he's half dead. You have to stop. This isn't a consumer option. It's not an individual preference. It's not an act of self-interest. It's an act of love for God, without which you cannot be close to God. It's absolutely central to the law, as the law guy says. And the last thing, which really I think is the most important thing that Jesus says, is go and do likewise. He doesn't say go and agree. He doesn't go and tell people. It's a do. It's a do. You have to do stuff. So what I want to suggest to you, well, to be honest, what I want to tell you is we are facing the most astronomical need to help those that are about to or are entering into undescribable suffering. We're not our half-dead guy on the roadway is the billions of innocent people in frontline communities across this world who are being systematically deprived of their lives and livelihoods for the greed of others. That's what's going on. That's the project. And we have an absolute imperative to stop that injustice, to enter into whatever it takes to save those lives, if we are to have any claim to love God. So in terms of practicality, I'm a practical sort of guy, as some of you know. So this call, as far as I'm concerned, is not another cozy seminar where we can all agree on how terrible something is and something should be done. I think in the present context, that's a violation of our faith. I think what we're presented with here is a clear choice. So I'm going to actually make that choice to you now in this call. I want to suggest you can do two things. You can make a commitment to give $1,000 to Extinction Rebellion America, and/or you can make a commitment to engage in civil disobedience to the point of being put in a prison. I just want you to think about those options. And if you're prepared to do one of them genuinely, then I want you to put your hand up now. Okay, thank you. So I suspect that the call so far didn't engage your emotions particularly strongly. But as soon as I actually suggested you do something, then a whole host of emotions raised their heads, right? A slight irritation, a slight embarrassment, a slight sense of guilt, maybe a strong sense of guilt, an annoyance. So what I want to do in this sort of tradition of practical witness is just have a minute's silence while you just listen to those emotions. I don't want you to judge them. I just want you to do it as an exercise of self-knowledge. What was coming up when you were thinking about raising your hand and whether you raised it or not? So we'll just take a minute just to listen to what was going on in your head and heart. Thanks. Okay, thank you very much. You can put your hand down now, by the way. So I don't know what thoughts and feelings were going through your head, but I want to respond by drawing on a few a few points that can be drawn from the Christian tradition, which may help us at this time. Because I think why I think the Christian faith is so central to the response that we need to have on the catastrophe that we're faced with is that the Christian tradition is focused on how to bring us out of selfishness into love. And really that's what the project is here, that a critical mass of people have to step out of that closeness, that guilt, that fear, that selfishness, whatever it is that's inside you, into a state of love which involves the practical engagement and risk of taking action, whether financially or physically at this time. And I think a central notion here is this paradox that to find yourself is to lose yourself. In other words, you have to lose yourself in order to find yourself. Now, I apologize, I don't quite know where that is in the Bible, but for me, like it's the central paradox of spiritual wisdom. And a lot of people can sort of, superficially agree with it, but it's actually massively confrontational, because what it's saying is that we have to stop calculating, right? You have to stop sitting on the call going, well, maybe that's going to risk my job. Maybe I haven't really got that much money. Maybe I can do it a little bit in the future, right? That's all the attempt not to lose yourself. The act of taking that risk, the act of stepping out and helping that person in the road is an act of overcoming oneself, overcoming one's ego. And it's also overcoming our attachment to the material world, which is a massive taboo, is it not? I mean, when I was a teenager, it used to drive me mad because I was super impressed with this guy called Jesus saying, the phrase like, it's more difficult for a rich man to get into the kingdom of heaven than to get through the eye of a needle. It's there, right? This isn't just a throwaway phrase. And I think the meaning of that phrase is not a moral point, even though it can be interpreted as a moral point about the immorality of exploiting others and what have you. What it's saying is in terms of spiritual growth, in terms of you entering fully into the Christian faith and loving God as is the project, as it were, you're not going to do it while you're worrying about your job, while you're worrying about your house, while you're worrying about your pension. You're not going to attain the spiritual wholeness that's being offered by Jesus in those passages. And I want to draw on probably one of the most famous quotes about this. So if you just bear with me. This comes from Derich, I think, Bonhoeffer, if I pronounced it right. So as some of you may know, he was a Protestant minister who was jailed by the Nazis and killed by them in 1945. And he, in one of his most famous passages, he says, Christians, mere waiting and looking is not Christian behavior. Christians are called to compassion and to action, right? Interestingly enough, this is letters from prison, right? This is not some abstract theological, discussion. This guy's in prison saying Christians are called to compassion and to action. And in the famous sort of passage, he talks in the in one of his books, he talks about grace. So cheap grace is the preaching of forgiveness without requiring repentance. Baptism without church discipline. Communion without confession. Cheap grace is grace without discipleship. Grace without the cross. Grace without Jesus Christ living and incarnate. In other words, like cheap grace is saying you care about the climate and doing nothing, or caring about the climate and thinking you're entering into grace and doing something that has no material effect. So what does true grace look like? True grace is costly grace. Costly grace, as he says, confronts us as a gracious call to follow Jesus. It comes as a word of forgiveness to the broken spirit and contrite heart. It is costly because it compels a person to submit to the yoke of Christ and to follow him. It is grace because Jesus says, "My yoke is easy and my burden is light." In other words, unless you're prepared for the sacrifice and cost of engaging in a full confrontation with the catastrophic evil which is now prevalent in our societies, then you're not even close to following Jesus. That's what it's saying. It's a brutal and extraordinarily honest and frank communication by Bonhoeffer as he's sitting there in prison. But there's another side to it, as it says in the end of the quote, which is in fact the most costly thing is not to move into that grace, because moving into that conception of who you are is actually less costly. It's a light yoke because you're coming into communion with Christ. And communion with Christ is the state of equilibrium, as I would call it, right? Where your conscience is answered, right? Your love of God is being enacted. You're not being cast out by your selfishness and by your false wisdom of safety and security and not taking risks. And for me, like, the thing that the Christian faith communicates is that this world is a test. It's not a material world in the sense of accumulating stuff and safety. It's a moral world where you're tested by God. And what we're called to do at this moment in history is enter into resistance, like Bonhoeffer did, against the radical evil of the proposition of mass death. That's the test of what it means to love God at this moment, on this call, being asked to do something concrete, which is engage in civil disobedience and give that money, right? It's a practical thing. Jesus didn't go over, the Samaritan didn't go over to the guy in the ditch and pat him on the head and leave him a plaster, right? He took him to the doctor. It involved money. It involved time. It involved risk and sacrifice. That's what Jesus is saying when he says, go and do likewise. It's a do thing. It's a get your checkbook out and pay thing. It's a go and risk getting into trouble, getting arrested, being put into prison, right? You're getting that guy to safety. You could be attacked. And through that process, you enter into the love of God, which is the primary purpose of your life, right? That's what the Christian faith is about. And there's a different side to this, okay? This is not in the Christian tradition, particularly in the Old Testament tradition, there is a consequence right, of not entering into that path. The consequence is being thrown out of that grace into evil, into residing with the devil. And the devil, traditionally constructed, what the devil means is that voice in your mind saying, I won't give the $1,000 tonight. I'll think about it tomorrow. I'm almost there on civil disobedience, but I'll think about it, right? It's the intellect, it's the lawyer, right? You know, all those talks I was told about when I was a teenager. You always had the lawyer there, didn't you? You always had the scribe. You always had the intellectual going, I'm going to think about it. No, 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 right? Entering into communion with Christ is not cognitive, right? It's a feeling of wishing to be whole, regardless of that voice in your head, which is the voice of the devil at the present moment, because that voice is what's sending us to hell, both spiritually and practically. And that's the tradition of the Old Testament, as I understand it, right? And this is not like symbolic. Social collapse in America is a major possibility. It's an inevitability unless there's massive change. It involves heartbreak. It involves physical injury. It will involve death. Right? Being thrown into hell is a real thing. And we will enter hell to the extent that we refuse to enter into communion with Christ. That's the proposition of what it means at the present moment. But I have to say that I think there's another story. And this other story for me is like the ridiculousness, the foolishness of God as promoted in the New Testament, in the teachings of Jesus. And when I was a teenager, I went on lots of Christian camps. And I remember this story when this Christian missionary was in some gangland in a city area in America. And he was surrounded by the members of this gang. And the members of this gang were going to kill him. And I remember the missionary, he said to them, you can kill me, but God will still love you. And for some reason, that's always stayed with me, because there's some outrageous ridiculousness to it, right? There's some outrageous foolishness in it about it. But for me, I have this intuition, and maybe some of you or other people can communicate the wisdom of this better than me. But for me, there's some ridiculous notion in what I have to communicate to you is, even if everyone on this planet facilitates and engages in the destruction of this planet, which is the destruction of God, God will still love us. God's still going to love us if we totally fail. And there's something about taking that into your heart that maybe is going to propel you into realizing that you receive so much love from God, the least you can do is love God in return. And that's the heart of the crucifixion. God gave his only son for us, for our sinfulness. And what we are called to do is to step up into our love for God in return. And at the present moment, what that love involves is a resistance, like Bonhoeffer says, right? A compassion and action to prevent the indescribable evil that we all know is upon us. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you, Roger. That was fantastic. We're going to take some questions now, and Terry will be asking the questions. Terry, do you want to unmute yourself? getting the questions for Roger, and then Roger can answer.
Sure. Am I coming through loud and clear?
Yes, you are.
Okay. All right. Hi, Roger. Wow, man. Whew. Powerful, powerful message, powerful, powerful vision. So just as a reminder to those who are on the call, if you post a question in the chat, it will be passed on by the host, who is JLo. He'll pass it on to me, and we will pick the ones that seem to be of most interest, given what Roger has been saying. We don't have very many right now, so feel free to start posting them in the chat, and JLo will filter them through, and I'll present them to Roger. Roger, I want to start with, actually, this is one of my own that I think resonates with one that was also asked by David in Australia. David asked, the historical Jesus challenged both the Roman Empire and the religious leaders of his day. What empires do we need to challenge today? So if you want to respond to David on that, then I'll kind of footnote it with my own perspective on it.
Could you just repeat the last bit of it? Sorry.
What empires do we need to challenge today? Like he challenged the Jewish leadership elite and the Roman leadership elite. Who do we need to challenge today? What empires?
Well, I was going to say, just in response to the questions, that to reiterate what I said at the beginning of my talk, which is I feel a massive I feel a massive lack of expertise, right? I can't set myself up as some sort of official authority on these matters. All I'm offering to you is what I'm called to say, and it's for you to assess whether that call is authentic or not. Okay, and that's as much as I want to do and as much as I can do, but maybe that is a lot. I don't know. It's not for me to say. Having said that, just to reveal my contradictions in full display, there is no question in my mind or in my calling that what is being engaged with by the powers that be is the greatest evil in the history of humanity. I don't know how we can even consider that being debatable. I mean, we've just heard, you know, from those scientists, they're the people that are telling us about the people in the ditch, right? The robbers in the Samaritan have not half killed one man. They're in the process of killing the entirety of humanity. And they know it, right? They know it. This is well known. These are the top professors at Harvard. And knowingly engaging in evil is the most terrible sin. I don't know how to describe it. And there's an absolute imperative to go into resistance. And I use that word for what it actually means, in the sense that Bonhoeffer used it and the existentialist theologians used it in the mid-20th century. This is not an abstraction, okay? These theologians that went into resistance against Hitler and died were not abstract theologians. They understood what it was to be in the path of God at a time of astronomical evil. And we have an absolute imperative to go into resistance against the American government, against the British government. And that involves civil resistance, as it did in many times before in Christian history, when the rulers engage in astronomical evil. It's central to the Western tradition. It's central to the traditions of of many, if not all religions, there are limits, right? When the temporal violates the spiritual. We're not talking about, we're not talking about some utopianism here. We're not talking about the rough and tumble of politics. We're talking about catastrophic evil. And it's at that point where Christians have to be absolutely clear. Absolutely clear. And this is not an abstraction. It's not an abstraction, right? It's a practical proposition. Over the next few months, people have the opportunity to disrupt the state. And they have an imperative to disrupt the state to the point of being imprisoned, as thousands of millions of Christians have done in past generations in order to follow God.
Okay. That's very clear, to me at least. Thank you. David, I hope that pretty much clarified it for you. I mean, he pretty much called out, I think, specifically the US American Empire and the British Empire, which is pretty much the Western world. So there's at least that much of the empire in the crosshairs from what Roger's talking about. There are a couple of more questions here, one from Dan in Oakland and another from Jim in Wisconsin, which have to deal with what will we demand if and when we overwhelm the power structure? That comes from Jim in Wisconsin. And I think he's thinking not in terms of the demands as we go into civil disobedience, which are already specified in the XRA demands, but if we win, when we win, if we overwhelm the power structure, overthrow those empires, what then? And I'm going to assume you're going to talk about the citizens' assemblies as the ones who will formulate those. But I don't want to speak for you, so there you have it.
Well, what I'd like to speak to is the desire to know, right? I think the desire to know at this stage is one of the major impediments, right, to stepping into the light of God. And this is what I mean when I say that the intellect is in some sense the same as the ego, right? It's like, it's us thinking that we can run the show. It's us thinking that we can work it out and we can win by ourselves, right? We're going to do this, and then we're going to do that, and then we're going to do that. And what that usually ends up as an excuse for inaction, because we go, well, we're not quite sure what will happen then, and we're not sure about that, and that could go wrong, and it could all end in tears. And that's not what walking in the light of God means in 2021. And I'm saying this as a nerdy intellectual, right? So I'd love to spend several hours talking about the minutiae of citizens' assemblies. But that's not what this call's about. What this call's about is having the humility to realize that you cannot do it without God, right? You cannot do it without that emotional imperative to go to the guy in the ditch and help, right? Not knowing whether you're going to get to the end of the road, not knowing how much it's going to cost when you get to the inn, not knowing whether he's going to die on the way, not knowing how much money it's going to be when he goes back to pay the debt. You see what I mean? It's like he has one thing in his mind, which is this man's in suffering, he's in pain, and injustice has been done. He's been attacked by the robber. The next step is to go and intervene to help that man. So the next step for Christians is to say to the American government, to state governments, this cannot go on and it has to change. And to choose something, right? To choose a demand. Certainly, we live in the real world. That when the Samaritan was going to the half-dead guy, he had a plan. He was going to pour oil on wine on. So he had a plan, but that was it. He had a plan for the first step. and he didn't know whether it worked. So all we need to know at this step, at this stage, is the absolute imperative to engage in the first step of civil resistance. Now, once that step has been enacted and we've fulfilled our obligations to God in doing so, then it will be revealed what the next step is, right? What I'm trying to say is over-intellectualizing an existential crisis is more often than not a subliminal desire to avoid our responsibilities, right? It is. Let's be honest with ourselves. And that's fine, right? If you're planning going on holiday, you want to know all the steps. When you're dealing with the children in your house on the top floor, you know, burning to death because there's a fire, you don't have the time to intellectualize. What you have the time to do is to look at the next option, just knock down the door and run upstairs. You're not sitting around working out what to do with them, whether, you know, how badly injured they're going to be, right? This is what it means to be in a crisis. And let me make absolutely clear, I'm not against intellectual labor, right? I'm not against rationality. What I'm against is the use of the law, the use of tradition, the use of skepticism to avoid our responsibilities. And as I said, that's a central theme in the New Testament. You know, Jesus is always being asked those clever questions, isn't he? And he's always, you know, saying, get on with the job, basically. That's my understanding of what the guy's saying. Yeah. And citizen assembly is a great idea, by the way. Yeah, we can talk about it on another call.
There was also a question about how to get the heading for Extinction Talk into churches. And I think the follow on when we talk about interacting with Extinction Rebellion America will answer that question. Sticking with that practical perspective and not being intellectual about it is a bit of a challenge with the questions we're getting, but one came from Tina in Vancouver that kind of poses the perspective a little differently. In the story of the Samaritan, the man acts upon something that is immediately in front of him. Part of the problem we face is that it's increasingly immediately in front of us in terms of, for instance, the heat domes in the Pacific Northwest, the floods in Germany, et cetera, et cetera. That's immediately in front of us, but the victims aren't as clearly in front of us as the Good Samaritan was, right at hand, unless I think we go out and find them. So how does the church step up to that?
Well, I could say that the devil's a sneaky bugger. There's a tradition, isn't there, in the Christian tradition, in a certain Christian tradition, there's the notion that the devil's always trying to trick us, right? And there's another notion that God is always there to test us. And my orientation on this, and you know, this is what I'm called to say, as I've said initially, is that we've got soft, right? We've got too self-congratulatory, particularly in the middle-class churches of the global north, right? It's like, everything's fine, we've done well, we've had the money, right? This is a common theme. There's a common theme in history that Jesus was exploding at his time, was the complacency of staying within the law, right? The complacency of being one of the chosen. It's like what God's saying is, I'm always here to test you. And each test is going to be different. And each test involves a new rediscovery of what it means to walk in the light of God, right? Every age produces a new conundrum. There's a new twist to the play of being in this life. And, you know, there's a direct analogy here with the Nazi period where there was that, we're doing fine. You know, the Nazis will never kill the Jews. They'll never enact such extreme evil. You know? And then suddenly it was there. And it was a test. It was a test of us understanding what it means to help others, to stand up for justice. And the test at this time is to understand that just because it's not right in front of us doesn't mean it doesn't exist. And what we've got to benefit of ourselves, of course, is our education and our communication systems. So this is the situation that we face. And we all know, right? We could talk, you know, I could talk for the next half hour about the psychology of proximity and all the rest of it. But in religious terms, it's what we're here to do, right? This is our shift. We're in the world in 2021. It's our time. And in our time, we're asked to step up into this particular gruesome, overwhelmingly, you know, horrendous situation. In Jesus's time, people were asked to walk to Jericho and help a man that was on his deathbed, right? I mean, arguably, that was worse. We don't have to do that. What we have to do on this call is give the $1,000 and sign the piece of paper to say we'll get arrested, right? Doesn't sound too bad to me. So yes, it's a challenge, but you know, welcome to free will.
Free will confronting reality, hard and fast. Yeah. Wow, we have some really interesting questions here. Someone who identifies themselves as Temple of the Waters is essentially asking about action and communications. How do we bring enough together, enough across religious boundaries and social boundaries and cultural boundaries and all that? How do we bring amass enough civil disobedience, if you will, together, or just to confront? How do we bring that mass civil disobedience together? That's not specifically what he asked. He says, how can we reach across to one another to face the gravity of things? And how do we do this without needing to be perfectly heard or healed? I'm not sure which it is, or perfectly prepared, which we clearly don't have time for. So how do we communicate quickly enough and build the mass one voice of civil disobedience that's needed to move forward with this in the time that remains?
Well, on a theological level, just to sort of continue the theme, right? It's to listen to the voice of God rather than the voice of the devil. And I don't mean that in an abstract way. I mean it in a very concrete way, that when everyone was thinking for a minute, that's what was happening in your brain, assuming you have the self-knowledge to listen to it. And we all have it, right? This is what it is to be human. You have free will, and you have the way of the devil, which is the way of closing off and separating yourself off. Like the definition of evil is disconnection, right? Is to disconnect from the suffering and injustice of others, or to enter into the light of God, which means in communion with God, which is in communion with love, which means engaging practically in the injustice and sufferings of others to prevent that injustice. So the religious imperative at this time is to engage in those single or small group acts of resistance. That's the practicality, right? Again, I could get nice and abstract about it, but it's not. It's not an abstraction. It's like, okay, so the Portland government is not going to protect the people of Portland and allow them to burn to death in the next 5 to 10 years. Right, we will now go and close down a motorway. We will now go on hunger strike. We will now sit in the railroads, right? We will now close down economic infrastructure. And then what happens is not for you to work out, right? In religious terms, right? Your job, your calling is to go and do the action, and God will reveal to you the next step. That's what I suggest. Okay. In other words, to enter the humility of the uncertain, right? Because all you're going to do by using your intellect is to build castles in the sky or you know, ghosts of procrastination, right? You go and act and you'll find out. Now, I could give a nice secular version of that, right? You know, in terms of nonlinear dynamics and what have you. But it's the same thing in complexity theory, right? Which is, you don't know. We don't know how to build a mass movement, okay? No one knows. I mean, we have some hunches, but what we do know is there's 44 people on this call and 20 of you are considering doing civil disobedience, and JLo's there and he's got your details, and next week you can join together and there's a civil disobedience campaign and you can join it. That's all you need to know. That's what Jesus is telling you in the story of the Samaritan, right? You're going to help the guy and the rest will be revealed. And this is like, you know, I'm repeating myself, but I want to emphasize this is the central challenge to the arrogance of humanism, right? Which pervades Western culture. And this is why we're in such a mess, because we're all trying to work it out, right? We're about to head for the most enormous fall from grace because we have the arrogance of thinking we can live without God, right? We can do it all ourselves. And that's the way of the devil, right? We have to accept radical uncertainty because this world is run by God. It's not run by us. We're not put on this world to create our own whatevers, right? We're put in this world to enact the will of God. That's the religious orientation. That's the religious position. That's the Christian position. And I can say as an award-winning social scientist that it's also the most effective mechanism to create rapid political change, right? It's the virtue ethics, right? It's the virtue ethics orientation, which is central to the Christian ethos, is we are standing up and doing the right thing because it's the right thing, and that's sufficient at this moment in time. That's it, right? So, you know, that's embedded in the civil rights tradition in the United States, as I'm sure everyone knows. It's embedded in the radical traditions of Western Christendom, is to step out and do the right thing. And that's the glory of it, right? The glory of it is the not knowing. That's the paradox, is once you've let go, it all becomes more glorious. And that's what Jesus is saying. That's what Bonhoeffer is saying when he's saying the yoke of Christ is not so burdensome, because you're handing that responsibility to God.
Very good. There are recurring themes in the questions. I don't know who else is in the spreadsheet, but I'm unable to stay in one place, which is making it kind of difficult. Bear with me just 1 second here. There's one question from Eric in the Netherlands about you concluding that the only effective action will be civil disobedience. Do you actually see this as the only one way out? And what gives the mandate to do this? I feel like you've largely answered that, but if you could just sum it up in like a tweet size for Eric, I think that would be helpful.
Well, I think the reason people ask this question is because civil disobedience is framed in the word civil disobedience, right? Which makes it sound like a tactic, which it sort of is, but it's not, right? What civil disobedience is part of a set of activities which involve non-cooperation with evil, right? Non-cooperation with evil has the practical implications that someone's going to arrest you. In other words, it's a byproduct, right? Arrest is not a fetish, right? It's not like we're called by Jesus to get arrested. What we're called to by Jesus is to engage in compassionate, just action. And standing by is incompatible with just and compassionate action. It's a transgression. It's a sacrilege, right? At a time of evil. That's what the German theologians were saying. And it's a sacrilege now. It's a spitting in the eye of God. It's heavy, right? We're not talking here on this call about an option, right? We're not talking about options here which have minimal consequences. There are massive consequences, both spiritually and materially, as I've said. So the point about civil disobedience is we have to frame it within that religious terminology as Christians, right? This is not just a thing, right? This is an outcome of our faith. And that's what you're doing. You're walking out into the world to save that guy. You're walking out in the road, you know, you're walking out in front of the government buildings. You're saying, this will not happen. You know, this will not happen. I will not stand aside. And if people want to call that civil disobedience, that's fine by me. But what I call it is walking in the path of God at a time of radical evil. That's what it is.
All right. Good, good. Hope that was a helpful answer for Eric. I'm going to take a few seconds here and just kind of add my perspective, if you don't mind, as a former missionary and minister in the Christian tradition, full time. I found a pattern that was very helpful for me to stay on the path. There's a verse, can't quote you the citation, but the Bible itself being a lamp to my feet and a light to my path. It doesn't tell you it's going to show you the outcome. It doesn't tell you it's going to show the end. It just tells you to look through the light, see your feet on the path, see a little ways down the road. And what I would say you've done here is you've shown us 2 steps to take on the path. Give sacrificially from our wealth, and we are wealthy in this country, and give sacrificially from our time to stand on that path against the evil that wants us to throw us off of it. And my own experience has always been in ministry and mission. Whenever I see divergence in the path, this road, this alternative, that alternative, this action, this decision, et cetera, I just go, which one is the hardest? Which one pushes all my buttons at once, challenges me most profoundly and most deeply? That's the one I'm supposed to take.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think, you know, when I speak to people around the world, basically what I'm saying is, design your civil disobedience and then times it by 10. Right? That's the plan, right? You know, use your intellect and all your little ego-y mechanisms in your brain or in your group, and you'll come up with a plan, right? That's not the plan. That's the plan with all your, you know, fears and limitations. What God's asking you to do is to times it by 10, because what we're dealing with here is like radical evil. And then when you've times it by 10, you will start to understand what it means to bear witness, because you'll have the sleepless nights, right? And you'll have the massive internal conversations, and you'll have the rows with your partner, and you know, you're thinking you're going to lose your job. But that's what you're called to do because of the extremity of what we face. So you're totally right. At this time, the hardest path is the only path. And of course, the paradox is the only path to wholeness, right? This is what we need to understand and communicate to other people, whether they're Christians or not. The people who are going to suffer the most are the people who take the easiest path, because sooner or later they will be forced to take the terrible path, right? They'll be pulling someone from a burning car. They'll be dealing with social breakdown. They'll be dealing with the loss of their house and their income and their partner. We need to prepare. We need to prepare ourselves for that level of hardship, because that's very likely coming down the line. And this is what it means to give yourself to God, because you're no longer concerned with those sort of worldly, egotistical orientations. And it's a matter of spiritual growth. It's not a matter of overcoming your self-interest, right? You know, this is the big thing in America, isn't it? You know, that you've exported all around the world. Self-interest, guys. Yes, it's absolutely in your self-interest to choose the hardest path. That's what the Christian faith is saying at this moment in time, as I understand it.
Yeah. There are several questions here that continue to ask about specific steps, and especially how can I engage with my church, my local church on this? And what are the practical steps you could do within the church? So when you talk about preparation, which you just mentioned, preparing for the shitstorm that's coming, pardon my non-Christian French there. But when we're preparing for that, how does a church prepare for a flood of 1 billion people fleeing collapse before it gets to us? What can a church do while we still have that edge, short though it may be, to be ready for those fleeing billion suffering victims of what's coming and that they're already suffering? How does a church prepare for that? And I mean that very practically and spiritually.
Well, at the danger of repeating myself, it's another one of those I need to know the path before I step on it questions, right? You know, and this is the problem. The problem is the need to know before you act. Now, you know, I'm totally sympathetic to these questions, just to know. But I think what I want to try and communicate on the call, we're dealing on this call about spiritual resilience, right? About spiritual mastery of ourselves, of our ego, in preparation for death, in preparation for serving Christ, in preparation for the horrors that come down the road, quite possibly. And this isn't the only work that we need to do. Obviously, we need to think practically, and I spend 12 hours a day thinking practically. But the foundation of our morality and the foundation of our resilience is in the fundamental acceptance of our unknowing, right? It's the fundamental acceptance that we haven't got a clue. We haven't got a clue. I haven't got a clue how the church is going to actually do it. I mean, I've got a few ideas, right? But the practical question is not how is the church going to respond on this call. The practical question is what disruption are we going to engage in order to get the church into such a state of indignation that they start to understand their sinfulness at this time, right? Because what the church is engaged in is catastrophic sinfulness, which is basically to stand there and allow 1 billion half-dead people in the ditch to go to hell and just make nice comments, right? And it's our duty as Christians and being in the Christian tradition to look upon that as the same evil as is engaged in by our governments, because all the established institutions are facilitating this process through their inaction. And by inaction, I mean civil resistance, right? Let me be clear about that. I don't mean, oh, you know, the American Methodist Church has made a statement. You don't make statements outside Auschwitz, right? Do you? You don't make statements about the catastrophic life expectancy of Salvadorian sugar workers, right? No one gives a damn about them. But that's like the canary in the coal mine, isn't it? Right? These are the guys who are spending 10, 15 years out in 40 degrees temperatures before they die of liver failure. That's a direct consequence of the murderous system that these people are standing aside and allowing to happen. And that's the tip of the iceberg, right? Because in 15 years' time, there will be hundreds of millions of people trying to get out Central America because it'll be 50, 60 degrees in the summer. That's what we're facing. And what we have to do with the church is to go and do what Martin Luther did, dare I say it, and nail that accusation on their doors. And when they ignore it, we disrupt the church. Just as the church has been disrupted over and over again, right? In the process of Christian renewal. I mean, when I say this to people, people think this is some outrageous, antisocial, radical idea. The church history is full. It's absolutely full of the transgressions of the church and the reforms of the revolutionaries who bring the faith back to its core, right? Over and over again. And this is what's absolutely required at this present moment. There's no negotiation with the reformist church. The reformist church has absolutely saturated itself in something abominable, isn't it? It is. Let's be honest with ourselves, right? We've known about this for 30 years. This isn't something that's just arrived in the last year or two, and it hasn't quite got through, the second committee of the third seminar of, the Southern Baptist Church, right? They've known about this shit for 30 years. And now it's right on their doorstep, and they're still there engaging with the powers that be. It's sacrilegious. That's what it is.
Well, I'm going to defer to J-Lo here for a moment and let him take a look at the clock. We have about 5 minutes left. I'm full of questions and suggestions myself, and I'm sure others are. But J-Lo, you want to take the helm here for a second and let us know how to proceed with the 5 minutes that remain?
Yeah, I'd like to suggest, Roger, could you take 2 more short questions, Roger?
I'll try to.
Okay, great. Terry, how about question number 14 and number 16?
Okay, let me scroll down to those. (14) Anonymous. Would Roger speak to his own experience of the presence of God and Spirit during past rebellions? So I'm assuming that question has to do with the XR rebellions in London, for example.
Yeah, well, I think that's a really interesting question. I mean, I've just been talking to South Africa Extinction Rebellion, and one of the things I was trying to communicate, it was a little bit of a halfway house between a spiritual talk and an average talk. And what I was trying to get across to the secular left, as it were, is the total sort of incoherence of pretending that people are material beings when they self-evidently are not, right? We are not machines. We don't exist to eat bread. We exist to have meaning, to receive and give love, to have respect, to do the will of God, all these different non-material constructions. And it's a massive travesty of basic empirical reality to think that human beings are just things and they move due to impersonal forces such as class and economics and all the rest of it. And the reason I bring this up is because it's as if there's a conspiracy against us by sort of this materialist dogma that insists, and it is a dogma, it insists there's such a thing as the cost-benefit analysis, right? That there is objectively things which are bad and things which are good, and they are determined by material comfort, which is total nonsense, right? What happens in the Extinction Rebellions, and particularly in the first one, this is, I'll give you my example here, is due to this materialist dogma. When I helped design this April Rebellion in 2019, I was nervous because, I was on the videos and tens of thousands of people watching it. I was going, get your asses down to London and sit in the road and do the business, guys, right? And obviously at the back of my mind is this sort of materialist voice which goes, Roger, you're asking a lot of people and they're going to get really mad at you if bad things happen to them. And, it was quite scary. And then, of course, that was nonsense because people came up to me, I'm talking about dozens of people, right? People came up to me and they thanked me for helping to organize it. And a not insignificant number of people said to me, that was the best 2 weeks of their life. Now, that just explodes the materialist hypothesis. You see what I mean? what it does is it reintroduces the enchantment of reality with spirit. Right? That's what I would call it. That reality is impregnated with our sense of something bigger than ourselves, right? And when we engage in something that's bigger than ourselves, we experience ecstasy, you know, the wholeness of transgression against, you know, injustice, right? Now, I'm not making any deterministic guarantees that everyone's going to, you know, be in some state of ecstatic delight every time they're sitting in the road. The point I'm trying to make is we have to, and this is where the Christian faith comes in. It's a, you know, this is why I'm doing this call in many ways. We have to put into the public sphere the notion of the benefit of sacrifice, right? The benefit of going for the public good, the benefit of public duty, the benefit of the collective good, right? Not as an act of altruism, but as an act of self-interest, as an act of growth. You see what I'm trying to say? So he must never accept the frame, you know, that people in the media go something like, well, Roger, aren't you being irresponsible, asking people to put themselves into harm's way? No, I'm not. I'm inviting them to engage in the ecstasy and glory of rebellion. That's what I'm doing. Right? You know, read some history, guys. You know, you see what I'm saying? So, yeah, I think without sounding too grand, right? The Spirit of God is imbued in political rebellion, you know, and that's what I invite people to go for, as you know. Sorry, I didn't mean to speak for so long there, but you got me going.
That's
a
totally
good
great,
question,
Roger. That's totally great. Terry, if I can, I've got one question here that I want to definitely get to, and
Sure.
it's asked by Michael Dowd, and Michael has offered to Roger to get together with you and do a larger conversation, which we would definitely love to host. But let me read to you really quickly his statement, and then we'll go ahead and ask his question. As I read the full range of scientific, historic, and cross-cultural evidence, God, reality, has clearly revealed that there is already at least a dozen or more self-reinforcing feedback loops, tipping points that we've passed years or decades ago, and thus we are already in runaway and unstoppable mode. In other words, even if millions or billions of us engage in radical civil disobedience, God tells us that we are in an age of consequences no matter what. In other words, no matter what, we cannot stop the world's forests from burning, the ice of the world from melting, and the oceans from acidifying, the Gulf Stream from weakening, and the loss of the Amazon rainforest melting the permafrost. What do you see as the spiritual and moral purpose of civil disobedience in light of this?
Well, maybe this is a good sort of point to finish on, which is, you know, what I call the sociology of miracles, right? And miracles are a sociological phenomenon, as I would describe them. And by miracles, I don't mean, you know, turning rock into gold or something like that. What I mean is in the pit of social despair, a revolution happens that transforms society, right? And what I'm saying as a sociologist is that history is full, it's chock-a-block, right, with prophetic action which transforms societies. In fact, you might say it's routine. And we live in a society that has completely lost touch with the miraculousness of the Spirit, that in a matter of months, a whole society can change due to the fantastical enthusiasm of a new way of looking at the world. Okay, so let me emphasize, I'm not saying this as some sort of manipulation. Okay, I'm not saying it as if they believe it, it might happen. I'm saying it does happen, right? And it's very likely to happen. In some sense, it's inevitable, because the deeper the despair and the deeper the horror and the deeper the evil, the greater the potential for that transformation. That's the great paradox here. And this, if you want to speak the language of hope, this is the hope, right? The hope isn't that everything's okay and, you know, we'll come around. The hope is that we lose hope and we enter into the pit of despair, and through the loss of that collective ego, we transform ourselves into a power that cannot be stopped. And what I mean by that is 10,000 people getting arrested 5 times in 4 weeks, right? I'm talking concretely, okay? This is not some vagueness. But those 10,000 people have to be animated with the propheticness of the desire for justice and the desire for spiritual integrity. And that requires leadership. And that's what everyone on this call is called to do. Because needless to say, you know, thousands of people are not on this call. But the people on this call, if you hear what God's saying to you, you'll be hearing that you have to step up into that prophetic witness. So, you know, it's a combination of that oratory and, of course, good old-fashioned, you know, getting on with the job and working out which road you're going to get to. But let me just finish by saying, like, we're not going to create this transformation without being massively fearless in our speech as well as our action, right? You know, I mean, on this call, like, I'm juxtaposing this humility I have, but you can also hear my voice, my absolute rage, my absolute lack of compromise in the face of a catastrophic evil. And that's what's going to change the United States in 6 months, right? Is when people get on the media, they are going like hell. You know, they're going like something no one's seen for 30 years, right? You know, you have to get into that studio and give them hell and let that rage for injustice speak through you, right? Because that's the life force that's going to save us, and it will save us, right? If it finds its power, you know, that's the God inside us, isn't it? Right? And all the intellectual stuff and all the planning stuff is irrelevant, right? You know, it's like when I go in a studio now, I'm just full of fearlessness because I'm done, right? I'm done with all that working out. If I say that, if they say that, I'll say that, I'll say that, if they say, you know, all that bollocks. I'm going in there and I'm just full of the Holy Spirit, as you might say, right? I am coming down on you guys, you know, this is it. And they don't know what to do. They don't know what to do. I mean, I was on Andrew Neil, right? I'm not saying, you know, it was a great performance. I don't care whether it was a great performance, right? But this is my proposition. 400,000 people watched that video. It's the most viewed video on their bloody channel, right? It's a right-wing channel. And I think the reason is because they could feel the spirit moving through me, that I didn't care. I don't care anymore, right? I don't care whether he talks about the Holocaust or talks about some sexual you know, if he wants to destroy my character, go ahead, right? Because I'm done, right? This society is going to destroy itself, and you better get with the program. Otherwise, you're in hell. You see what I mean? And that's the language that's been spoken like for millennia, right? In the human experience. That's what it means to be a prophet. That's what it means to do prophetic witness, is to allow that force to move through you and to be what it is. And the rest you leave to God, right? That's the proposition.
Thank you, Roger. JLo, was that a good enough answer? Michael, was that a good enough answer?
That was great. Wow. I'm glad we're recording this.
Yes.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody. Roger, is there anything else you'd like to say before we call it?
No, I'll apologize again in advance for my lack of theological solidity, but and I'll see everyone on the practical meetings.
Thank you,
Thank you
Roger.
very
I'm going
much.
to go ahead and share the screen and just let people know and remind them of a couple of things. What you can do to help out and support Extinction Rebellion, our program, which we're very grateful that Roger came to speak today and that all of you showed up. You can volunteer with us, you can donate, and you can come see a Heading for Extinction talk, which talks about the science and what to do about it with specifics. And then you can attend our Nonviolent Civil Disobedience workshop. So there's a lot of work to be done.